Make sure it's zoomed out. Make sure it's on. We did that already, didn't we?
I worked in the camera set. Don't be all shaky and nausea camera. So that you can keep both hands on the wheel. You can't hold it like that and drive on the freeway.
I can give it to you.
Where do I hold it?
You have to flip the screen around where you can see it.
Well, that's a pain, and it's going to be all shaky.
Not if you hold it steady.
Well, I can't even find your head. There. Like this. I won't be able to hold it steady with the camera.
You gotta cradle it.
It will be nauseous now. I'm supposed to hold this for a half hour. No.
Cradle!
No, Brad, I got you picking your nose. This is going to be really...
Cradle.
Yeah, cradle.
Sure you can.
No, I can't see the screen.
We can flip the screen around. Different things.
There. That's good. Is it recording?
Yes.
Okay, I need to ask you about your earliest memories, not memories of like just in the house with mom and dad, but earliest memories that involve awareness of the world around you.
Mm-hmm.
What was going on in the world around you in your early years?
Living in a very small trailer, unbelievably small. What's now called a mobile home, but back then was called a trailer, which had one bed, a couch, a kitchen area, and no bathroom. You had to go outside to the bathroom.
Were there cars like that one around?
That's a 55 Chevy. This is before then. I'm remembering 1948.
1948. What did Dad do for money?
He was always working, either as a mechanic or working in a machine shop or working in a factory.
This was soon after the war. Do you remember anything about World War II?
Nothing. No, because...
People even talking about it?
No, not really, because the war ended, didn't it, in 45, 46?
45?
45, so I was born in 43, so I can only remember like starting at age 4, 3 or 4.
Never heard your parents talk about people they knew who'd been in the war?
Not too much, no. How do you know you're not cutting my head off?
No, I'm not. Putting to the screen or not. What's your earliest memory of music as a kid?
Earliest memory would be, well, the ones that I remember would be, there was a song called You, You, You. If I knew you were coming, I'd have baked a cake. Hot you do, hot you do, hot you do. The Happy Wanderer, and that one by Julius La Rosa, Hey Compadre.
Where were you hearing music? On the radio?
Hearing it on the radio and in restaurants, and what were called jukeboxes for a nickel. I remember all the music before rock and roll got started. Rock and roll really didn't start until Bill Haley and the Comets and Elvis in about 53, 54. But I remember music before then.
Yeah, well, how was it different?
It was just pop music, catchy tunes. Like If I Knew You Were Coming, I'd have baked a cake, and You, 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 and catchy tunes.
Your parents were Southerners. Was there country music in the house at that point? Bluegrass in the house?
On the radio, there would be country music. I mean, the old country music like Hank Snow, Hank Williams, Ernest Tubb. Music hadn't caught on and got popular yet. That didn't really happen until Buck Owens came along. And then it happened a lot after the Beatles came along.
You remember when Hank Williams died?
No, I do not. Do not remember it at all. I don't remember being aware of Hank Williams as a person, just aware of his music, mainly some of his songs. I Saw the Light.
Did you get hauled in the church to listen to church music?
My mom and dad didn't go to church. My grandparents didn't go to church, but I always had friends that would. I would always kids that I would play with. Chums would go to church, and I'd end up going with them. Places like the Church of the Nazarene, the old-time religion.
I didn't know your folks didn't take you to church.
No. Never. I don't think my dad ever went to church. I never went with him. Grandparents never went. Not to my knowledge.
Do you remember any music at Shelley and Elijah's house?
Yeah, I've got one. It's at 45 by Don and Earl. It's called Satan's Satellite. We'll go zoom, zoom, zoom way beyond the moon. Take a trip along the Milky Way. Don and Earl were two bluegrass gospel singers that were on the radio, and they offered records. And my grandmother had one, which I persuaded her to let me have, but it's not in real good shape, but it's still playable. I'd love to find it. It's on Starday. I'd love to find a better copy of it.
Shelley and Elijah have a record player?
They did. So he likes my car. He gave me the thumbs up. He'd really like it if he saw the other one. Yes, I had a record player, mainly 78s. The first 78 I ever bought was Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer by Gene Autry.
What year was that, you know?
About 1950.
Oh, so you were just a kid.
I would have been 7.
But your mom and dad didn't have a record player, just Shelley and Elijah?
Shelley and I had one at first, and later we got one, a little cheap one. That, you know, when rock and roll started, mainly in 55, 50, well, 50, the middle, 57, 58, then we had a cheap record player where we could play 45s.
Were your parents buying records or just you?
My dad would never buy a record, very seldom. My mother would buy one once in a great while, but mostly it was mine.
What was going on in the world around you in terms of the Cold War and the war in Korea?
A lot of talk about Eisenhower, a lot of scary talk that the Russians could drop the atomic bomb and we'd all be blown away. And then of course, if they drop the atomic bomb, you need to hide under your seat. You need to get under your seat, so you'll be okay.
In school, did they
Duck and yeah, a little bit. Yeah, what to do if the bomb strikes? You know, get under your seat and cover your head.
Did you or anyone else that you knew your age have any concept of who the Russians were? Or
no,
where they lived?
only they were very evil. We were just told they were very evil, and they wanted to conquer the world.
Do you know what communism was?
Just heard that it was really bad. It's where the government rules everything and tells you what you can do and what you can't do, and censors what you get to read and what you get to see. There's no freedom.
Did anyone tell you why the communists wanted to kill you?
But yeah, because they wanted to dominate the world, and if you didn't want to be a communist, they would kill you.
You think people believe that?
Yes, they did.
Do you remember the war in Korea?
Very vaguely. I remember more about certain movies about it, war movies, like with old-time actors like Frank Lovejoy and what's his name, Ray.
What was
Aldo Ray.
You went to see a lot of films as a kid, I think.
Yeah, I did.
Films and old serials.
Yeah.
What were the topics? Were they comedies? Were they musicals? What kind of things did you go to?
Well, the movies were great back then because for the child's admission when I first started going was 10 cents. Later it went to 12, then it got really high, it went to a quarter. But on a Saturday, when you go to the theater, the first thing you would see would be, you'd see previews of all the movies that were coming. After you'd see the previews, you'd see a newsreel. After you'd see the newsreel, you'd see a cartoon. Then you would see a short, like a Three Stooges short, which would be like maybe 15 minutes. And then you would see a serial, and then you would see two movies, a double feature, like the Bowery Boys and a Western or two Westerns together. So there was quite a lot of entertainment.
Yeah, how many hours would one quarter buy you?
I think it seemed like it was always about 3 hours. A lot of the Bowery Boys movies were an hour, and the Westerns were an hour, and the serials were 10 or 15 minutes. The comedies were 10 or 15 minutes. I think probably 2 hours.
What were the newsreels about?
They were the news of the day, whatever was topical, with a voiceover announcer. But they did show newsreels. The problem with the newsreels was it was always old news because it had to be filmed, it had to be edited, had to be prints made and distributed to theaters.
Were you watching camera angles even then?
Yes. I became aware of camera angles by reading comic strips, though, starting with the Sunday comics, and the daily newspaper strips, and then imagining that what I was seeing on the screen was very similar to comic style angles. And then I started noticing directors like Alfred Hitchcock that put the camera up real high and look down, or real low and look up, or Orson Welles would be moving the camera, so I was aware.
When did television come along in your house?
I think we had a television by 1952, and they were very expensive, outrageously expensive. You know, back then when people were making like $1 an hour, 75 cents an hour, a television would cost you $400 or $500.
Wow. You had to buy it on an installment plan?
Yeah, and pay a lot of interest. The first shows I remember, the early shows, the reason I wanted to have a television was to watch Captain Video and Space Patrol and a show called The Hunter, which was about a detective. And then, of course, I Love Lucy.
Were there musical programs on TV then? Were you seeing singers for the first time?
Yeah, but variety shows like Ed Sullivan would have guests on. I mean, Ed Sullivan's where I saw, and the world first saw Elvis Presley. It was on Ed Sullivan. Buddy Holly I saw on Ed Sullivan.
Wow.
The Everly Brothers, Fats Domino, all the original, you know, the founding fathers of rock and roll were on the Ed Sullivan Show.
When rock music first started, what was your reaction? What was your parents' reaction? How were you exposed to it?
On the radio and in restaurants on jukeboxes, and in a movie called Blackboard Jungle, which featured Bill Haley and the Comets singing "Rock Around the Clock." I mean, once everybody heard that, they knew rock and roll was going to be the big thing in music. Then there was Elvis Presley and all the different Elvis Presley imitators and singers like Jack Scott, people you forgot about. Then, of course, the ones you remember, like Bill Haley and Fats Domino and Little Richard.
Was it considered shocking or rebellious? Or?
Not at all. The media made it shocking and rebellious. The average person just listened to it and liked it.
Oh, so there wasn't that outrage like
No.
when the punk era came along, they tried to make it real shocking. And
No, that's portrayed on the air sometimes with white ministers from the South trying to burn the Elvis records or burning rock and roll, saying it was the work of the devil. But when I was a kid, no one was aware of that I know of.
You first heard Elvis, you heard him sing before you saw him?
Yes.
You saw what he looked like?
Yeah, saw him once in person.
Oh, yeah, I want to ask you more about, when you first heard him, did you think he was black?
No.
Did anyone else?
Not anyone I knew thought he was black, because there were a lot of pictures of Elvis in the newspaper and in magazines. And also when his album came out, he was on the cover of his album. I mean, when we heard him do Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel and Blue Suede Shoes, nobody thought he was black. No.
Was there any stigma at the time about listening to black performers if you were white?
Was there any stigma about listening to black?
Yeah.
White people didn't really listen to black music that much. They weren't aware of listening to black music that much. Or didn't, you know, I didn't know where there was any black music. I think once in a while I'd be aware, like a group like the Coasters singing Get a Job, they were black, because you'd see them on Dick Clark, or you'd see the Platters, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, they were black. I mean, it was just whatever happened to be on the radio and whatever happened to be popular would get played and would get heard.
Yeah, tell me about seeing Elvis.
Elvis was just catching on. It was a pretty big phenomenon, and he appeared at the Toledo Sports Arena in 1955. And I went with my mom and dad, and we were way in the back, but I could see Elvis. He was pretty small. We were quite a distance from him, but when he came on, you really couldn't hear him sing because the audience was screaming so loud. It was very hard to hear him sing, and there were a lot of people fainting and being carried out on stretchers.
I was thinking you had seen him in Indiana or Illinois.
No, I never did. We used to go to Indiana all the time to a place called Buck Lake Ranch in Elkhart, Indiana, and that's where I met, you know, like a handshake and autograph from legendary people like Ernest Tubb, Johnny Cash, Buck Owens, all the famous country singers.
Met Johnny Cash?
Yeah.
I didn't know you met Johnny Cash.
Yes.
Were your parents big fans of those singers as well?
Yes, definitely big fans of those singers. Ernest Tubb, I'm Walking the Floor Over You, Webb Pierce. They all showed up there. They were all there at Buck Lake Ranch in Angola, Indiana. It was about a 100-mile drive, but it was worth it. It's the only place you could see these singers. Porter Wagner was there.
Did you have any awareness that you were Southern and that these singers were also Southerners?
Yes. Yep, I did do that.
Was it something your folks talked about? Or?
They were Southerners. It was pretty obvious they were Southerners, and they would go back and visit once in a while to Alabama and Mississippi, and a few times I went along. A few times we even drove. Once we drove our 55 Pontiac to Alabama, and on the way we stopped at the Grand Ole Opry because I wanted to see the building, and there was nothing going on the day we stopped, but I did get to stand outside the building.
How did you know about the Grand Ole Opry?
We used to listen to the Grand Ole Opry on the radio every Saturday night. It's a radio show. There's a lot of listening to radio. Before I had a television, when I was living in the trailer, before I even started school, I remember listening to all the The Shadow, the Green Hornet, Batman, Superman, Straight Arrow. There were a lot of shows. Bobby Benson, the B-Bar-B Riders. There were a lot of Captain Midnight. There were a lot of adventure shows on the radio to listen to.
That was something that kids at school then talked about? Oh, did you hear that radio show?
Yes. Did you hear Captain Midnight last night? Mm-hmm. I remember sometimes I would be in a hurry to get home from school so I could listen to the shows because we didn't have a car in the radio.
You didn't have a radio in the car?
That's right.
The car didn't fit in the radio?
We didn't have a car in the radio.
There you go. Were there other kids of Southern parents in the area?
A few, yeah, because a lot of people from Alabama and Mississippi moved to Michigan in the Detroit area to get jobs in the auto factories. A lot of those people were from the South.
Was there any social stigma or anything attached to being a Southerner? People think that was weird to folks from the South? Or?
Well, depending on who you talk to. I mean, I would guess that many people thought if you're from the South, you never finished school and you were ignorant.
That kind of hillbilly stereotype?
Yeah, it's the hillbilly stereotype, yeah.
Considering that performers like Elvis were from that same area, were people looking at him as some kind of hillbilly too? Or
yes,
did he
definitely.
Mainstream Southern people?
At first he was looked at as a hillbilly, and then he became a role model for other hillbillies. You know, people thought, well, you know, just because you're born poor and you're in the South and you're born poor, Elvis showed that you could still be successful if you had talent and management. He had management.
You remember Elvis being some kind of personal hero?
I think everyone liked Elvis. His music was good, and it was always a spectacular event to see Elvis on television. And his songs were played constantly. I'm all shook up, 45s and Blue Suede Shoes, Don't Be Cruel. The songs were played all the time.
Were there people around you who didn't like Elvis?
There would be kids in school that would say, I don't like Elvis, but they would do it just to be contrary, just to be different, because, he didn't want everybody to like someone.
What age were most kids when they took an interest in rock music? Or did people
I think it started when most people I knew were about 10 years old. 10 on up.
Were kids trying to dress like Elvis?
Yeah, they were. They were dressing like Ricky Nelson, who was dressing like Elvis, because you could see Ricky Nelson. Ricky Nelson was accessible on television on the Ozzie and Harriet show. Once Ricky Nelson started singing rock and roll and combing his hair in a certain way and wearing a certain type of clothes, that's what you would see. So people were really imitating Ricky Nelson, who was imitating Elvis.
What about other non-musical icons today, like James Dean?
James Dean didn't at the time have too much of an impact, although there was a lot of publicity, especially on the two movies Giant and Rebel Without a Cause. But I always, James Dean was just too sad and too brooding for me. He seemed to be miserable, and it wasn't a happy experience seeing James Dean movies.
What about Marlon Brando?
Marlon Brando, again, was perceived and on the waterfront in The Wild One as a guy who was kind of miserable, lost, out of place, unhappy.
Was this the beat poet generation?
I didn't become aware of the beatniks till about 1957. 57. Then we were aware of beatniks with poetry readings and playing bongos, and On the Road and Jack Kerouac and Henry Miller and authors like that. And then thankfully the beatniks and the coffee house thing created an atmosphere for folk music to get popular. For the Weavers to start playing, Pete Seeger, and then for people to commercialize that music, starting with the Kingston Trio, going to the Brothers Four, Peter, Paul, and Mary, the Limelighters, the Chad Mitchell Trio, on and on and on.
Was folk music something that your parents and everyone around you was taking an interest in, or was it just college kids or a certain group of people that seemed to be following?
The parents didn't seem to like folk music other than what they heard on the radio, which would be like Tom Dooley or MTA or Worried Man, but the parents weren't really buying the albums. I think high school kids were, and college kids in particular. The Kingston Trio was the hottest act in show business, and it was all done with no hype, hardly any publicity, no newspaper ads, no television ads, just word of mouth, people hearing them on the radio and buying the records and going to their concerts.
What was it about that music that appealed to you? I mean, it wasn't rock and roll, it wasn't country, it was something that you hadn't had any.
That's right. It was it seemed to be a combination of the best vocals you could hear, like the vocals you were hearing in rock and roll with Roy Orbison and Elvis Presley, and then country music, kind of combining good vocals with country music and turning it into folk music, hearing the banjos and the guitars, and it was acoustic, and the harmony, the two-part harmony, and sometimes three-part harmony, that you'd hear from the Everly Brothers and other country groups.
The Everly Brothers considered a rock band or a country band?
I think they were considered a rock band, but they really do have a history of being country. I think they were the first country rock band, I would consider them. Elvis was very country too.
Before I ask you more about folk music, back to Buddy Holly.
Yes.
Did you remember when Buddy Holly died?
Yep, remember the day, remember everything. When I first heard, the first Buddy Holly song I heard was That'll Be the Day in about 56 or 57. And I liked his voice. I thought that was the most exciting voice I had ever heard. And then I got to hear him more with Peggy Sue and Oh Boy.
Did you go out and buy the record?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
So you were quite young, though. You were about 13 years old.
13, yeah, I went out and I bought That'll Be the Day and Oh Boy and Peggy Sue.
Was Buddy Holly considered pop music for people who were as young as 13?
Rock and roll pop music, but clean, wholesome pop music. More like along the lines of Pat Boone. Clean, wholesome pop music. There was nobody saying anything bad about Buddy Holly. And I saw him a couple times on, first time on Ed Sullivan, and then again on American Bandstand. And then when Buddy Holly died on February 3rd, 1959, I just overnight lost interest in rock and roll music and started listening more to folk music, which I had been listening to at the time, starting with Tom Dooley from the Kingston Trio.
Do you think Buddy's death really made a major impact in the media and in just your friends? And
No, it made hardly any impact. The only impact it made for people my age, who I was 13, and for other rock performers, especially the very young rock performers.
You were 16 when he died.
16.
15 going on 16.
16. But for other rock performers and for the listeners and rock and roll fans, it was the first time anyone had died. I mean, Waylon Jennings talks about that. When Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Richie Valens got killed, it was the first time they had actually, I mean, they knew them because they were traveling with them, but it was the first time an audience in a long, long time, you know, since people like Rudolph Valentino and other icons had died. But for the young people just getting into rock and roll, it was a big shock that these famous rock and roll heroes that you were hearing every day on the radio and buying the records, suddenly you had to realize, oh, they're not going to be singing, there's not going to be any new records. Of course, records came out after they were Yeah, but these songs had already been recorded, but it was a shock. It was a shock that brought people into more of an awareness.
You think that the 50s were really a kind of good time, happy time, post-war boom, family-oriented that you see on like Leave It to Beaver kind of shows and Happy Days? Is that realistic? Is Happy Days realistic for you?
No, it's not realistic. In the 50s, the only thing you knew was what you heard other people tell you, like teachers, what your teachers told you, what you read in textbooks, what you heard on the radio or saw on television. So the media pretty much controlled all your thinking and all your information. And even back then, I couldn't figure out, answers to very simple things like going to the South. Why were there black restrooms and white restrooms? Why were there black water fountains and white water fountains? I mean, that was strange to me even as a child.
Did you ever ask your parents?
Yes.
What did they say?
Their answer was because that's, more or less that's the way it is.
In the South, do you remember ever talking to black people or having any interaction with them?
Yes, I do.
What was that experience like? Was it?
They seemed to be friendly, for a child going downtown. They would say hi, I would say hi. My grandparents had black people that lived on their land that they rented homes to and that worked on their farm.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
So they lied?
There was no hatred. I mean, I don't remember any hatred. I think the media caused that. The media stirred up the hatred.
Wow.
I don't remember any hatred. I just remember the black people and white people being they were separated. They didn't live together. There'd be a black section in town, a white section in town. They didn't intermingle. There'd be black kids in school, and everyone would get along.
Oh yeah, your school you went to in Michigan in the North was never segregated.
No, never.
South. So, did anyone ever question about black kids being in the school?
Never heard anyone say anything about black kids being in the school.
Were there any Mexican kids at that point?
Yes, there were. Yes, there were Mexican kids too. Mm-hmm.
You ever see any Asian people?
Very few. Very few. When I didn't start seeing Asian people till I got out of high school and started going to Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. There you'd see people from all over the world.
Did you ever feel like you'd grown up pretty sheltered compared to a city like Ann Arbor where you couldn't meet people from all over?
Yeah. I mean, it was a pretty controlled environment. It was mainly living with white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That was my environment as far as the neighbors, the school. I mean, there were a few Catholics once in a while, but that was pretty much the extent of it. So it was pretty sheltered. It was a very limited experience in the real world.
What do you remember about any kind of social awareness around you? Like, I'll go back to the folk music. Most folk music, not all of it, but most of it was we had a social message of some sort.
Right.
Did that heighten your awareness?
Yes, it certainly did. It certainly did, because the folk singers were singing about take a song like Cotton Fields, by the Highwaymen. Cotton Fields brought an awareness of black people picking cotton. A lot of the songs talk about slavery. There ain't no cane on the brazos. Did give you a social awareness. And then when it became political, when the folk singers were singing political songs, especially anti-war songs in the middle 60s, it helped create a lot of awareness through folk music.
In the very early 60s, do you think the music was just reflecting what was going on in the world? Do you think it was actually creating feelings about situations that people wouldn't have had otherwise?
I think it was reflecting and creating. It was definitely doing both. Because people needed a purpose and a reason, and they needed something to do and some causes to get behind. So I think people like Pete Seeger prompted that.
Pete Seeger always seems old to me, like he was old even at the time.
He was old. He seemed to be old. Even in 1960, he was old. But
Go on.
the music I was listening to was what I would call commercial folk music. That's the good time, non-political. The Kingston Trio never got political. The Brothers Four. The first group to take on the politics was the Chad Mitchell Trio. They started doing it, singing about the John Birch Society and criticizing the president. and then that kind of got to be hip and cool. And then people came along, took it further, like Phil Oakes as a protest singer, and Bob Dylan, of course. Of course, Bob, to the right or to the left?
What street we on? Sunset to the right. No, to the left. I'm sorry. Where are we going? Simon's?
Studio Film and Tape. Yeah, so it was to the left. No, it's right up here.
Oh, I'm really confused.
Okay, tell me more.
Stop and think about some questions before.
Okay, coming up to Simon's Camera, which is by...
Yeah, prior to the folk era in the 60s, had you ever heard people criticize the president?
No, never. People would say they didn't, you know, you would hear things like Roosevelt really sold this country down the drain. I never knew what that meant. You know, or you would hear Truman was a bad president, or Eisenhower was a bad president, or if the Republicans take over, we're all in big trouble. That's all kind, just general things like that.
Did you ever yourself have any opinion on the matter, or even care? Was it part of your world?
No, I was just taught the Republicans was the party of the rich, and the Democrats were the party for the working man.
But Roosevelt was a Democrat, and at the same time you were hearing he'd sold the country down the
I had heard that. Yeah, I was hearing that. I'd never gotten the information to back that up.
We'll end here, and I'll ask you more about the folk era. Let's see, I was holding it. It was kind of uncomfortable.
There's probably if I were shooting you, I'd be holding it down like this, so I'd have some cradleness.
Like where?
I don't
That's
know.
your steering wheel. That doesn't get you. Turn like you're driving. Yeah, I guess that's...
Maybe, maybe not. Everybody's got it different, whatever you like.
Well, no, it's just kind of awkward. I'd like to just turn and aim it at you, but I don't feel comfortable being in the car with no seatbelt.
Oh. Yeah, that'd be the easiest. Would be to look through close the screen, look through the viewfinder even.
Yeah, but that's kind of weird show. People don't realize how much effort, physical effort, exertion goes into just holding the
Really?
camera.
Try holding a 35mm handheld camera for long periods of time like I used to do.
Even Beaker and I just taken still photos of each other. We realize that is a lot of work.
A lot of work.
And you think models just stand there, but that's a lot of work.
It's hard work.
You actually do it. It actually is uncomfortable.
That's why they make lots of money.
Because they're beautiful and make lots of money.
Well, you can be made to look better, you know, that 81A filter.
Yeah, that's what I need. Here's a question. You were born in the 40s.
43.
Most of your experience of what the world was about didn't happen until the 50s.
I wasn't aware too much of things until the 50s, yeah.
Then you came into your own as your own person in the 60s. What generation do you consider to be your generation? Like what era? What do you look at and
Gosh,
go,
I
yeah,
don't know.
that was me. That was my stuff.
It'd be the Beach Boys, which would be the late 50s, early 60s, you know, and the Beatles.
What did you think of the Beach Boys and surf music at the time?
It was good. It was good. And Jan and Dean and the other surf type group, it was very easy to listen to and it was a lot of fun.
I never thought of you as a Beach Boys fan in the least.
No, but some of the songs were good. So, you know, like The Little Lady from Pasadena, and there were a few other songs. They were just catchy songs that were played on the radio.
When did you start considering yourself like an actual music collector? Like if people ask you your hobbies, you'd say, "Oh, collecting records would be among them."
By 1959, because I was at that point collecting the Kingston Trio records and 45s.
Do you remember the price of a 45 or an album?
Yes. Seemed like I bought an awful lot of albums for $2.98. The discount stores, you know, used to sell them for $2.98, and I bought a lot of records for $2.98. If it was an album that wasn't real popular and you had to go to a music store, they would be $4 and $5.
That was a lot of money compared to wages at that time.
Yes, it was.
Where were you getting money from?
I had a job in a factory and started in '62.
No, but in the late 50s you didn't have that job.
No, I didn't. In the late 50s, I'd be lucky if I could buy a single once in a while. I think the singles were, I believe they were under $1 for a 45.
Of course, that would have been like an hour's wages.
Yes, it would have
I
been.
mean, compare now, of course, I guess the CD single is about $5.
Yeah.
Were you aware at all of the technology
Sure did.
program
Oh
like
yeah.
that?
I wasn't even able to do the basics. Like there were a lot of TV shows I wanted to. I mean, finally I got a tape recorder and I was able to audio record. And I was always thinking, wouldn't it be great if I had a copy of the actual TV show? And I just couldn't imagine any way to do it. I tried shooting off the television with a Super 8 camera, but you'd get a flicker. But there were a few things I tried copying off the TV, but video didn't exist for the consumer at that point in time.
Were other people aware of that, saying, "Gee, you know, the program I'm not going to be able to see it. Wish I could tape it"?
Yes. I'd say in the '60s, the early '60s, yeah, a lot of people were aware of needing to do that. And then they came out with primitive recorders. Sony had a reel-to-reel video recorder.
They did?
Very primitive, yeah. Dennis Skotak had one in about the early '70s, black and white. There was there was a black and white reel-to-reel Portapack. Yes, there was. Panasonic had one and Sony had one, but it wasn't until the early '70s.
I did not know about that.
The thing I never dreamed of, when I made my first movie, I knew the only audience for it was going to be drive-ins. It would have, you know, or if we got lucky, it might play on television, but I never dreamed that there would be a home video. That movies would go on to video cassettes and you'd be able to buy them and rent them and play them at home.
Do you think at the time you thought of experiences as more historic and like more a real monumental event because it was going to be a one-time finite thing and there'd be no way to replay it? Like if you went to see a band play, you think, wow, that was it, because you know that performance is now gone forever. Were you aware of things like that?
Yeah, of course. I always thought that the bigger and more important groups probably made tapes of the shows, and I took a little tape recorder into some shows. I mean, in the '60s there were battery-powered portable reel-to-reel recorders recorded on small tapes, and then later Sony came out with the cassette recorder, the audio cassette recorder.
Were people at the time like, these things weren't small enough to sneak it in your bag or something?
No, they were.
They were?
Yeah.
Were people aware of, oh, you shouldn't be taping the band?
No.
It's a lot easier to photograph anything you wanted at that time?
It was no problem to photograph anything you wanted. Yeah, I don't think you would have had any problem at all. I mean, I can't recall any concerts being restricted on taking pictures, certainly not the country shows or the folk show.
Who was the first band you saw on your own?
On my own?
Yeah, let's say you'd been to country shows with your folks. When did you start going without the folks? Who was it?
Oh, it would have been folk groups, folk music, like the Kingston Trio.
They were already big stars. What kind of venues were they playing, size-wise?
College auditoriums. The same auditoriums where they would have basketball games.
Whoa.
Or fairs. I met Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs at a county fair. I met Chad Mitchell Trio at a county fair in the early '60s.
You saw the Mitchell Trio with Chad Mitchell and then again with John Denver?
John Denver. The first time I saw John Denver, they appeared at Adrian College, believe it or not.
But had you seen
John Denver.
Chad Mitchell himself?
Yes, I had. I met Chad Mitchell in Jackson, Michigan at the Jackson County Fair. Crossed over, went backstage and met the original Chad Mitchell Trio, and also met Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs.
People that were playing the fair circuit, did people go, oh, those are like has-been, washed-up artists? Or
No.
Mainstream artists?
Mainstream. They were mainstream. The hootenanny craze had caught on, so every fair wanted to have a hootenanny.
Can you define hootenanny for me?
It was a phrase made popular on television when there was so much folk music and all the folk singers were traveling to colleges. Somebody got the idea, instead of just seeing one group at night, what if we saw maybe 6 or 8 groups, and we'd call that a hootenanny, which would be like a party atmosphere with various folk singers, a group of different folk singers. And that idea got so popular, they just said, why should we have, solo artists and duos and trios? Why don't we have big groups? And then they formed like the Back Porch Majority, the Randy Sparks Singers. There were groups with like 9 people in the group.
Do you remember some of the main events of the day in the early 60s?
course, Kennedy, of course.
Russians in space. What do you remember about those?
I don't personally remember Marilyn Monroe dying. I don't remember the day that happened. I remember the day Kennedy got shot. That was pretty spectacular. People didn't know what to do.
Had your family voted for him?
Pardon me?
Had your family
Yes,
voted for him?
yes,
Even though he was Catholic?
yes.
Where were you when Kennedy got shot?
Home, getting ready to go to work in a factory, getting ready to go to work on the second shift, which started at 3:30, and I think I heard at 2 in the afternoon Kennedy was shot.
Did the whole community just kind of freeze in motion, or people keep going, or?
Everybody kind of froze in motion. Didn't know what to do. I mean, you tried to do things, but it was almost it was impossible to get your mind off of it. Of course, it's all you were hearing on the news. It was pretty shocking. Sadness. My dad, who's always been a really tough guy and never showed any emotion, when we were watching the funeral on television, I looked over at him and he was crying, and I started crying.
Oh, that was a coyote in the road.
Yeah, it was.
But what did you think of LBJ?
Didn't like LBJ.
He was a Southerner.
He was, but he always seemed like he just wasn't a likable president. It seemed like he was really promoting the war in Vietnam too.
Yeah, when did you first become aware of Vietnam? During Kennedy's time or after?
After the Kennedy time. During the LBJ time.
How much of an impact in your life was the Vietnam War?
Well, you know, no one liked the idea of going to Vietnam.
And had you ever even heard of Vietnam or knew where it was?
No.
Did you even know what a Vietnamese person looked like?
No.
Did you understand why they said we had to go?
Nope, did not.
Do you think anyone did?
A few people. It wasn't common knowledge. It was just promoted as a patriotic thing to do, to serve your country and go fight the Viet Cong.
What were your parents saying about it?
I think they just felt like that's what you had to do. If the U.S. government was doing it, the president said do it, then that's what you did.
Did you know a lot of people that had to go?
Not that many. No, during my time, if you were in college, you didn't have too much of a problem. You were exempt.
Was there any awareness that it was mostly poor people and black people that were being sent?
No. No.
Was that something that the folk music wasn't addressing?
Folk music kind of enlightened you to that. Vietnam songs by Country Joe and the Fish and by Phil Oakes. Social satires that made you aware that the war was being conducted for other reasons, political or financial gain.
When JFK was assassinated, did you believe the official story?
Yes, that Harvey Oswald shot JFK. Yeah, didn't doubt it, didn't question it.
Had there ever been around you any fears of suspicion of the government ever? People just never question things like that?
Not in the 60s. I would say not till the late 70s.
Wow.
Was there any suspicion the government was ever doing anything wrong, or that any political leaders were ever guilty of any wrongdoing, that any of the presidents weren't squeaky clean? Never a doubt.
Knowing what you know now in the modern era, and then looking back, do you think you just feel like everyone's deceived, or do you think how it could have been somebody,
I was deceived all my life looking back. Conned all my life. The 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, there was a lot going on that the average person was not aware of, because we didn't have the information. It wasn't in the media. It wasn't talked about. It wasn't written about. And if you did write about it or try and expose it, it was only through certain publications, and these people that were criticizing were kind of branded as communists or right-wingers if they were saying anything about the government.
perfect? Was it from the music? Was it from the press? Was it from friends at college?
I think it started in the movies with little hints, like movies like The Manchurian Candidate, which were about brainwashing and brainwashing people, hypnotizing them to be political assassins. Songs, articles that were coming out, various truth publications like The Realist by Paul Krasner, who's still alive, lives in Venice Beach.
Were those people, though, considered as fringe as people now who like publish UFO publications? And things?
No. No.
Do you remember a time when you just felt like everything shifted from black and white to color?
No, I remember everything was in color from the start.
Do you remember the shift, though, in television, like when television...
Yeah, and some people were lucky and got color TVs early. I mean, I don't think we had a color TV till maybe 1970, 71, 72. Watched a lot of television in black and white.
Which do you think had the biggest impact on you? Television, movies, music, school? What do you think was the main influence on you?
Movies. Movies and television. Movies first.
I don't know how to turn this off.
Where the zoom control is? Is it zooming out or did it zoom out?
Yeah.
Okay, now if you hit the button in the center, now you see a record on the screen? Mm-hmm.
We'll just jump ahead. Chicago 1968 Democratic Convention. What do you remember?
Well, I remember the Skotax. I knew them then. I met the Skotax in '64 when we were going to the Ann Arbor film festivals, and I met people at the film festival. And Gary Crowdis, who I started Cineast magazine with, was very politically aware, a lot more politically aware than I was, because he was going to go to NYU and get in that whole political cinema thing. But I remember the Skotax saying that they were going to go to the Democratic Convention to protest the war. And Dennis took his 16mm camera with him, and I'm really certain that he's got some silent footage of Phil Oakes performing.
You were a big fan at the time Phil was performing.
In this, yeah, I went back and got the early stuff. I think I got his like third or fourth album. Then after getting the third or fourth album, then I got everything as it would come out. And then I went back and collected the early stuff that I hadn't played before.
Growing up, I remember all the E&M albums. I don't remember any of the Electro Folk albums that you ever played in the house.
You don't think we have any?
I know we have them, but I don't remember you ever playing I Ain't Marching Anymore. I remember when he moved to California.
Oh, I played I Ain't Marching Anymore a lot.
Playing the New York.
Yeah, Links on the Chain, I Ain't Marching Anymore, yeah, I did.
How did you never manage to see Phil?
Always missed him. I think I had opportunities. He played in Ann Arbor at the Chessmate, no, in Detroit at the Chessmate, and he must have played in Ann Arbor, and I probably didn't get interested in his music till after he had moved to California. He probably wasn't around.
What did you think of the whole Chicago 68 thing? What impact did it make on your people?
Well, I thought, well, you know, the movies that came out at the time, like in 1970, was Getting Straight. It was about college campus protests, and of course the song 4 Dead in Ohio was about the people that got killed in Ohio protesting. I just thought the government was really overdoing it. I mean, here's these peace-loving hippies with peace signs and flowers, and they're saying, you know, we don't want to go to war, and our own National Guard shooting them. Thought that was definitely wrong.
Do you know who Abby Hoffman was?
Yeah, because I'd read about him and hear about him on the news, but he was considered pretty radical and pretty right-wing, even for the people who were protesting the war. I think he was
Left-wing, you mean?
left-wing. I think he was pretty extreme.
So what did the Skotax have to say when they came back from Chicago?
Well, you know, they've got stories about getting beat up. Elaine's got stories, you know.
Oh, she went?
Yeah, getting beat over the head by National Guards with clubs and getting shoved out of the way. And knocked to the ground, and trampled, and those kind of stories.
Oh, should have you heard?
See, Haskell Wexler knew, and everybody knew there was going to be violence at the Democratic convention. So Haskell was thinking, if I took a couple of the real actors with me, and we act like we're a news crew and go in with press badges and everything, or everyone thinks we're just a news crew or an independent news crew documenting, we're not going to have any problems. So he was smart enough to have his real actors march through the protest, and people were so involved in what was going on that they didn't pay any attention to the actors. They didn't know, golly, these guys are using this background footage to make a movie, because that's what he did.
Oh,
and also, by their special effects guys had fake tear gas, and it was color. They had it was like colored smoke. They were just smoke bombs. I don't think it was really tear gas. It was smoke bombs. And at the end, there's one point in the movie where Haskell's shooting, because Haskell, always liked Haskell because, you know, he's a pretty famous DP. People recognize him because he shot Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. He shot In the Heat of the Night. There's one scene where he's shooting the scene from Medium Cool, and the sound guy says, "Look out, Haskell, that one's real." And it was like a real tear gas thing, so he got away from it.
Wow.
Because they had some of their own smoke bombs they were using.
So that film that came out at the time, came out in 68, 69, do you remember?
Yeah, I saw it in the drive-in. I remember the opening shot very well. The movie was shot in Technoscope, which was a half-frame 35mm system. It was like 16mm, but twice as wide. So shooting in Technoscope, you could shoot widescreen, get a widescreen movie, but it was cheaper to do. And I think some of it was shot in 16mm and blown up to 35. But it opens up with they're shooting an accident, and then they have to get the footage to the news station. So I think there's a lot of point-of-view stuff chasing a motorcycle. The guy's on a motorcycle. He gives it to a carrier, I believe. I think it opens with an accident, a car accident, and the cameraman, who's Robert Forrester, is out shooting the accident. Then he gives the film, the 400-foot 16mm film, to the carrier, who puts it on his motorcycle and goes driving off to get it processed and get it on the news. There's a lot of point-of-view shots following the motorcycle. Remember that. Then there's even kind of a hokey romance story tied in with it too. And I forget the guy's name. There's one guy in the movie, or there's two guys in the movie that got famous later. One guy played Joe in the movie Joe, the bald-headed guy Peter Boyle, and there's another guy who plays I think a cameraman or a camera assistant was on the Dick Van Dyke Show, I believe.
At the time, was it considered just mainstream Hollywood filmmaking?
No.
Kind of radical?
It was radical. It was like anti-establishment. Once Hollywood found out there was a buck to be made from the anti-establishment films, they jumped on the bandwagon. But Medium Cool wasn't really successful. I don't think it was not a big money maker. It wasn't like Easy Rider. Easy Rider was more of a commercial kind of movie. Medium Cool tackled the politics a little too much. I think the studios were a little uneasy with it, and it didn't really get the audience, a big commercial audience, because it didn't play that many theaters. I saw it in the drive-in.
Who was talking about it? Political activists or people?
You'd read a
cinema or
the audience would have been the college crowd, so you would have read reviews on it and heard about it through college newspapers. And in Ann Arbor, the Ann Arbor papers I got, in Ann Arbor I got the Village Voice, and also got, it wasn't the LA Weekly, what was it called at the time?
Press?
Yeah, the LA Free Press. Before it became a smut paper, it was a really good newspaper, and they had a lot of good reviews by Gene Youngblood, wrote for the LA Free Press, and he was always writing about movies like Medium Cool and the Andy Warhol movies and the underground films. He wrote a book on it called Expanded Cinema, which was his prediction of what would happen in the future.
Did you personally take any direct inspiration from that film?
Oh yeah, I personally did.
I mean, was that... Now we're recording.
You sure?
Yeah, I see the little brick.
Yeah.
So what, of all the time periods that you've lived
Okay, I got to tell you one thing. See this car over here? It's a two-tone green car, 55 Pontiac.
In fact, I could show it if I knew how to operate it.
See it right there? 55 Pontiac. Now, my dad had one like that, only a two-door. Guess who that car belongs to?
J. Lilo?
No, it's Mariah Carey's brother.
Oh.
He's got a little recording studio. It's like a dump. It's like a little stinky garage with him and his dog. And he lives in that recording studio. and that's his car. And he was quite impressed when I met him that I even knew what it was, let alone the fact that I said it's the first car I ever drove was a 55 Pontiac. And he's got one. Okay, back to the questions.
Back to the questions. I mean, just in your lifetime, you lived through probably the era, I think the last 50 years has been the most shocking, radical, innovative technology revolution ever in history.
I'll say.
I mean, it used to take hundreds of years to go from point A to point B, and now all the...
Well, I never would have dreamed about the internet. I never would have dreamed about email or cell. I mean, cell phones, I always thought that was going to be possible, because as a kid in the 40s, reading Dick Tracy, who had the two-way wristwatch radio, I always thought, yeah, it seemed like that would work. It seemed like they'll have something like that someday, but you know, it never got that small to be a wristwatch radio, but you know, the cell phones I never dreamed of. I tell kids now when I lecture, and like when I'm showing a movie or something, I'll tell them way back, before we had email or cell phones or sports utility vehicles or even home video, I made my first movie. And the only audience was in big cities at so-called exploitation houses that showed cheap horror movies, and at drive-ins. That was the only place that movie could play. There was no other venue for it, no other outlet. And also people think vinyl records, what's that? You know, you got to explain CDs. I mean, I guess when you record something now, Scott Shaw said he recorded an album and the guy sent it to him as a file. The whole album. It's on a file. It's as a file, so he can download it on his computer.
That's really disturbing. Of all the eras, you mean you were alert in the 40s, but not much.
No.
Thinking in the 50s, 60s, what era was your favorite? Why? Do you have any nostalgia, or are you just living in the here and now with no nostalgia?
No, I have some nostalgia.
So,
I have nostalgia for each era, and I'll tell you what they are. Okay?
Yeah.
I have nostalgia for the late 40s. I have nostalgia for the movie serials. I mean, I'm still haunted by the first serials I saw. And the one I remember, and I'd like to go visit this guy's grave. We should go look for it. Clyde Beatty, the world's greatest animal trainer, the world's greatest lion tamer. Did a movie called Darkest Africa, and it had these Batmen. They were called the Batmen. It had nothing to do with Batman the comic, but they were Batmen flying through Africa. They had bat wings and they had spears. And Clyde Beatty, that was like the serial that, wow, that was pretty shocking and pretty fantastic. An Undersea Kingdom and the Rocket Man. I mean, those are all incredible serials. Later, I got to meet the guy who made the Batman fly and made the Rocket Man fly. So I have a nostalgia for the late 40s. And then for the 50s, the nostalgia is the Westerns, all the great Westerns with Lash LaRue, whom I finally got to meet a couple years before he died and got to be friends with, and the Durango Kid and Tim Holt. There were a lot of Westerns in the 50s, and later the Westerns kind of grew up, and John Wayne started doing more like adult Westerns. But yeah, I have a nostalgia for the Westerns, of course, a nostalgia for the music in the 50s, the early rock and roll music like Jack Scott, Elvis Presley, Bill Haley, the Everly Brothers, Roy Orbison. The 60s, the nostalgia is for the folk music, the great days of the folk music. The late 50s, early 60s with the Kingston Trio, the Chad Mitchell Trio, the Highwaymen, the Limelighters, and all the individual solo artists like Phil Oakes and Tim Hardin. In the 70s, there seemed like in the early 70s there was a period where everything was pretty dead. There wasn't too much going on, and then kind of starting in the late 60s, Mike Nesmith and the Byrds, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Commander Cody got the idea of combining country with rock and roll, and there was a lot of country rock music in the late 60s and early 70s. But after country rock, it was pretty dead for a while, and it wasn't too exciting until late 76 when groups like Elvis Costello started, and Devo and Blondie and all the new wave punk groups. And that kind of died out in the early 80s. And there wasn't really anything to come along to take its place. And I remember the last part of the 80s not being too exciting in either film or music. But then in the 90s, the middle 90s, we got people like the Mavericks and Junior Brown and the Derailers, and finally some good music came back.
Do you remember in the 60s feeling any kind of shocking difference about your life compared to your parents' life?
Yeah. I always thought that I was a lot more aware of things and more open-minded, and like the Louvin Brothers song, the word open-minded is spelled S-I-N. That's one of their big songs. But just more aware, socially aware, politically aware, musically aware, a lot more aware. It just seemed like they just kind of took things for granted, really didn't investigate things or question things too much.
Did you think that was just between you and your folks, or was that the general between all the people your age and their?
I think it was all the older generation at the time were pretty much accepting. The younger generation started to question things in the 60s. In particular, I think after a couple of things happened, after Buddy Holly got killed, we were ready for anything. Okay, so somebody else could get killed, and they did. I mean, other country stars got killed, other rock stars got killed, died. You know, of course, the most famous being, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, because those all seemed to happen right about the same time, making one wonder if that was some type of a conspiracy to wipe those three out. There's even a guy I know who did a movie about it, saying that it was a conspiracy for the government to kill Joplin, Hendrix, and Morrison, but I doubt it, that it was. But yeah, after Kennedy, people started thinking about the war and the people that were against the war for the first time. I mean, in World War II, I don't think he had people saying we shouldn't fight the Nazis, but in the Vietnam War, people were questioning it and were wondering maybe it was for economic gain, maybe it really wasn't a righteous war, a war that needed to be fought. But a lot of the older people seem to just, the establishment seemed to just take it and accept it and not question it too much. But the radical people and the college-educated people started questioning things.
What kind of impact was the drug scene making at the time? Was that just something that you hear about in the press and you hear about in Hollywood, or was it?
It was making a pretty big impact on. Once the Beatles came on, all the folk music had to be electrified in order to compete. So groups like Simon and Garfunkel that were